Old Testament survey. This is the prophets, the major and minor prophets. Tonight we're going to survey the book of Ezekiel. And this is part 4 of our class of Old Testament survey, section 3. And we're saying that Ezekiel, in your notes, what does it say there in your box? He's the prophet of God's glory. And again, what we're doing with this is just try to do a big picture. It's kind of like an overview of, we're just flying over the book. So we're just trying to get the point of it. So I would say main points of Ezekiel is that he has some incredible interactions with the unseen world, with the angelic world, with angels. So that's one thing very significant about Isaiah. He sees the glory of God, and he also transported at times through the skies. And he's brought to certain places, and he sees things. He sees visions, many visions. So he has interactions with angels and sees like these very amazing, miraculous visions. For example, look in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 4 and 5 of Ezekiel, where he says, "And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire enfolding itself, and a brightness was about it. And out of the midst thereof, as the color of amber, and out of the midst of the fire, and out of the midst thereof came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance, and they had the likeness of a man." Now, if somebody walked up off the street and started telling you this, you would think, okay, sure, you would wonder what he had been, what he was taking, But Ezekiel had these visions. These are from the Lord. And he sees the glory of God. If you look at the end of chapter 1, look at the last verse 28. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 28. And Esther, could we start back with you if you could read that verse, please, for us?
As the appearance of the cloud is in the cloud in the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness round about. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face, and I heard a voice of one that spake. Okay, so the key phrase there, while we read that verse, it says, this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So that's what we're saying. He's the prophet of God's glory. We're gonna trace this through the book of Ezekiel as we overview this book tonight. Another thing, though, that's very interesting about Ezekiel is he sees Satan's works in human history. For example, if you look in Ezekiel chapter 28, and he's here talking about the king or the prince of a nation surrounding Israel at the time, of Tyrus, in Ezekiel chapter 28. And he's talking about the downfall of this human prince, a human king. But in that human king, we see really the downfall of Satan as well. So that's like, that connection is incredible. It's miraculous. For example, if you look at Ezekiel 28, look what he says in verse 12. He says, "Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus. Say unto him, thus saith the Lord God, thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty." So who is he talking about? Humanly. Tyrus? Yeah, he's talking about this king of Tyrus. He's talking about a real king, a real person who was alive during his day. But then, so this king was very proud and arrogant. And then he says in verse 13, "Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering. The sardius, the topaz, the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, sapphire, emerald, carbuncle, the gold workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in the day that thou was created. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth." So who is he talking about? Sounds like he's talking about Satan in the Garden of Eden, when he, maybe even before his fall or sometime in that period. But it talks about how he was a musical angel. Some people do get from this, especially at the end of verse 13. It says, "The workmanship of thy tabrets," that's some kind of a percussion instrument, and of thy pipes, a wind instrument, that Satan was a musical archangel. Have you heard this? You know that Gabriel, he's really the only one specifically called an archangel in the Bible, but he's like the messenger angel.
And then you have Michael, who's more like the military angel. And then you have Lucifer, who was the musical angel. And perhaps they were the top three angels in God's eternal, or when God created the angels. And then, of course, Lucifer fell. So many people say that this is really talking about Satan, even though he's talking about a human king. So that's very interesting. So the book of Ezekiel tells of God's glory in history, and then of his ultimate triumph, even though there is Satan's works. So we see Satan's works, but ultimately God's triumph over Satan. So let's look at this here. In your notes, whereas Jeremiah was a prophet mainly to the Jews in Jerusalem before the city fell, Daniel was a prophet mainly to the kings and rulers of Babylon. Ezekiel was a prophet to the exiles, to the people in Babylon before and after the fall of Jerusalem. So he was a prophet to the exiles. And I got this from your Geisler book, a popular survey of the Old Testament. If you even are able to find the first chapter, or the chapter that deals with Ezekiel, I think it's chapter 37. But this next point I'm getting from that, and I think, again, this is a good overview statement of the book of Ezekiel. That I kind of like those statements that give you contrast, like what's different about Ezekiel from Jeremiah? How are they different? In just kind of a very general way, but it shows their distinction. And I think this is a very good statement of how Daniel is different from Ezekiel, even though they were prophets of the same period of time. That Daniel looks forward to a political restoration of Israel. And Daniel focuses on world kingdoms, right? Babylon and Greece and Rome. While Ezekiel previews their religious restoration. And he's interested in the restoration of the temple. He's a priest, so he's interested in the temple aspects. And of course, he describes in amazing details the millennial temple. Oh, it's so amazing it might even put you to sleep. I mean, as you're reading it, it's like, whoa. It's like the details are just enormous. But he's a priest, and those details are very important to him. Okay, so Daniel was more looking forward to what? The political restoration. Ezekiel to the religious restoration. That's the first sentence of your Geisler book where he makes that distinction. So I like that. So the man in his times, he ministered from 593 to 570. So that's right during the deportations and then finally the destruction of Babylon. He's writing it during that time. His name means God will strengthen. God will strengthen. So whenever you see a Jewish name with E-L at the end, what is that? What is E-L always? That's the name of God, Elohim. Elohim, so Ezekiel or Daniel. Okay, so Daniel, Ezekiel, God is in their name, So his name is God will strengthen. And Ezekiel was he was a fearless prophet. Look in chapter 3 of Ezekiel. God tells him, don't be afraid of the people. Don't be afraid of their faces, because they're going to be looking at you like, Ezekiel, we hate you, with their faces. That would be hard to speak to people like that. You don't look at me that way. Thank the Lord, But Ezekiel said, don't be afraid of their faces. Fear them not. I'm sending you to this rebellious house. And look what it says in Ezekiel chapter 3. If you even look down beyond that, but I wanted to actually read verses 12 and 13. Christina, could you read those verses, please? Ezekiel chapter 3, verses 12 and 13.
Then the Spirit swept me up, and I heard behind me a voice of a great rushing saying, Blessed be the glory of the Lord from his place. I heard also the noise of the wings of the living creatures that touched one another, and the noise of the wheels over against them, and the noise of a great rushing.
Okay, so that actually goes back to chapter 1, 2, where he sees wheels and they're moving this way and that way, and he sees creatures with faces, 4 faces and things, and some of this is also in the book of Revelation with the faces, but then he says in verse 14, here's another, he was transported. The Spirit lifted me up, took me away. I went in bitterness in the heat of my spirit. You know what that means? Bitterness, the heat of my spirit. There was there's somewhat of there seems to be somewhat of a reluctance, but the Lord was like taking him and putting him into that place. And he says, in the heat of my spirit, but the hand of the Lord was strong upon me. And so then he came to where they were and he sat where they sat. And what does God tell him to be in verse 17? What's the word? What's the key word? God says, I want you to be a what? A watchman. A watchman for me. And then he says in verse 19, I want you to warn what kind of people? What does it say? What kind of people? Just the word there. The wicked. I want you to warn the wicked. And then he will also warn, verse number 21, who? The righteous. Warn the righteous and the wicked. And he was to be a watchman in the land. And Ezekiel wanted to be that one who would be whom the kind of man, God, that's the kind of man or woman, we could say, God is searching for. Look in chapter 22, verse 30. This is a great text of Ezekiel. If you've ever heard Ezekiel preach, probably this is one of the verses you'll hear preached. Ezekiel 22, verse 30. Who's got that verse for us? Christy, do you have that?
Verse 30?
Yes, 22, verse 30.
And I sought for a man among them that should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found none.
Okay, so he sought for a man to make up the hedge, to stand in the gap. Well, Ezekiel was that man, though. He was that kind of man who wanted to stand in that gap. Okay, so going back to your notes here, whereas Isaiah, he felt his personal uncleanness. Remember, he said, I'm a man of unclean lips. Jeremiah felt his youth. He said, I'm too young. I can't speak. I'm too young. Ezekiel went with, what was the word in our Bible? In bitterness, or with bitterness. And I looked that word up. I can't get away from it. It seems like an anger somehow. I don't fully understand that. But in the heat of his spirit, with astonishment. So God calls different people out of different circumstances with differing personalities. That's the point there.
That's right. You said that Elohim was the root of what name?
Elohim. Elohim, yeah, which is God in our English. Yeah.
So could it be the anger of like really not wanting to be God's prophet, or anger more like Jonah was like, well, I don't want to for these people, well, that's not clear.
Yeah, to me, it's not completely clear, but he was being told that he was going to go to a people who would not listen to him, though, and you know, in some ways, we want to do something where we feel like there's going to be a success, at least. Yeah, something like that. Maybe that's part of it, but I'm not certain. Except that that's his personality. But he still went and he did what God wanted him to do. And you know, sometimes when you start a task, you might not be that excited about it, but then when you do it, you're glad you did it. So I do believe that Ezekiel. You know, it's not like he was angry. God called him to be a prophet, you know. Okay, so his name means God will strengthen. He was a priest, chapter 1, verse 3. As we already mentioned, he writes from a priestly point of view. Letter B, Ezekiel was a prophet of the captivity. When he was about 18 years old, in 605 BC, the Babylonians made their first invasion into Judah. Again, if you look in do you have your book by Geisler? He has a little chart then, when was Ezekiel written? And I think this is actually very helpful here. And these dates that I have here also. So 605 BC was the first invasion of Babylon into Judah, which was the southern kingdom. Now remember, the northern kingdom had already been taken captive. So who was taken during that first invasion? Daniel was taken in the first invasion. Then 8 years later in 597 was the second invasion and deportation of some of the Jews. And who was taken in that second invasion? Ezekiel. So Daniel, D was taken before E, Ezekiel. D always goes before E. So Daniel was taken in the first invasion and Ezekiel was taken in the second invasion. That will help you remember that. So, and then the whole nation was destroyed in the third invasion. That was in 586. Okay, so Ezekiel was taken in that second invasion. Okay, so the theme of Ezekiel is the what? We already said it. The glory of the Lord. Key phrases are Son of Man, which stands for Ezekiel's identity. Many times you'll see Son of Man, which stands for Ezekiel's identity with the people to whom he was sent. And also a key phrase that appears more than 60 times in the book of Ezekiel is, and they shall know that I am the Lord. And they shall know that I am the Lord. And that phrase is a very powerful phrase throughout the book. God works even in removing his glory that we would know him. Okay, his call is given, his amazing call is given in chapter 2 through chapter 3. So, question, are the calls of Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel all given in their books? Yes, yeah. Which is interesting that God does call people to ministry. God calls people into serving him, and their calls are given. And so those calls are very important for us to actually look at and see, how they were called, and then also bring, apply these things to our lives and how God calls us to serve him. Okay, so he has all these visions. As I mentioned earlier, he has many interactions with angels and with visions of God. One of the key visions of Ezekiel, and we're going to walk through this a little bit. We're going to look at these verses under "Let There Be Amazing Visions," is the vision number 2, the vision of God's glory departing and returning. So I think this is kind of like a theme that really runs through the book of Ezekiel. This is the book of God's glory. And here we see the vision of God's glory. He sees God's glory. We already read that in chapter 1. He sees this vision of the angels and the glory of God and burning coals and fire and lamps and all kinds of things. And he concludes at the end in Ezekiel chapter 1, in that verse read, this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So let's just see what's going on here in Ezekiel for a moment. In chapter 8, he has a vision of the inner workings of the temple. And God, even though he's in Babylon, he's not in Jerusalem. The temple has not been destroyed, remember? Because he came in the second deportation. So the temple is still there. And God gives him a vision into what was going on in the temple. And there were occult, demonic practices going on amongst the leaders, the priests of the temple. And Ezekiel sees this. and it's in chapter 8 and verse number 11. And Micah, could you please read 11 and 12 of Ezekiel 8, please?
And there stood before them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel. And in the midst of them stood Jazaniah, son of Shaphat, with every man his censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. Then said he unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen what the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the chamber of his imagery. For they say, The Lord seeth us not. The Lord hath forsaken the earth.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I should actually had you. Could you read back up to verse 10? I'm sorry, that's probably a key verse there.
So I went in and saw, and behold, every form of creeping thing and abominable beast, and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed upon the wall round about.
Okay, so there was all these idols, and they were making idols of the creation of God and not the creator. And the 70 men, who does that reference? Who's the 70 men? That would be the Sanhedrin. So that's the leaders of Israel, and they were involved in this Egyptian cult worship of some kind, Babylonian mystery religions, infiltrating the temple of God in Jerusalem, where it says then in verse number 14, then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Now, that's straight out of Babylon. And the idea here is that some say that Tammuz had died a death, and then they were weeping for him, and then he supposedly rose again. So it's like a false gospel story. And they were weeping for 40 days. And many say also, I think in Hislop's Two Babylons, he goes into this where they were weeping for Tammuz, and that would last for 40 days. And that's where they get the whole idea of Lent from. Really from Babylonian mystery religions, obviously not in the Bible, the whole idea of Lent and everything. But anyway, so it just shows how idolatry and the cult practices of the pagan nations around Israel had infiltrated their worship. That's what's going on. So then in chapter 9, we see the glory of God leaving the temple. We see a vision of God's glory beginning to depart out of the temple. So in chapter 9 and verse 3, Jeannie, could you read Ezekiel chapter 9 and verse 3?
And the glory of the God of Israel was gone up from the cherub, whereupon he was to the threshold of the house. And he called to the man clothed with linen, which had the writer's inkhorn by his side.
Okay, so the glory of God was gone up, it says, to the threshold of the house. So the glory of God is beginning to depart. Then in chapter 10, if you look there in verse number 4, Mondello, could you read that, please?
Sure. Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub and stood over the threshold of the house. And the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was filled of the brightness of the Lord's glory.
Okay, so God's glory was there. Is still filling, it says, the court. But it seems that God's glory had left the inner sanctum, that holy place, and had departed from there. And then in chapter 10, verse 18, then we read this in 10:18. Eunice, could you please read that?
And the glory of the Lord departed from off the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubims.
And verse 19 as well.
And the cherubims lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight. When they went out, the wheels also were beside them, and everyone stood at the door of the east gate of the Lord's house. And the glory of the God of Israel was over them above.
Okay, so now it seems the glory of God had again kind of moved a little further out, and he was above. The glory of God was above them. And then if you go all the way down to 11 and verse 22 and 23. Okay, Anna, if you could read that, Ezekiel chapter 11, 22 and 23.
So the cherubim lifted up their wings with their wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was high above them. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain, which is on the east side of the city.
Okay, so, and then he says afterwards, the Spirit took me up and brought me in a vision. Okay, so again, it seems that the glory of God had now left the temple area and was on the east side of the city. So the glory of God is leaving the temple, his presence, and he leaves very slowly, it seems. It's like he gives them opportunity to see, here I am, and I am departing. But they're involved in this wicked pagan idolatry, and then his glory departs from the temple and goes to the east side of the city. So then the book of Ezekiel goes on, and then at the end of the book of Ezekiel, and from chapters 40 through 48, is the temple. There's a temple that is described in this incredible detail, and many believe it's the millennial temple. So what's going to happen when this millennial temple is built? Who's going to preside over that millennial temple? Jesus. Yeah. So here we're going to see the glory of God come back from the way that he had departed. If you look in chapter 43 and verses 2 and 3, and we'll go, Esther, could you read Ezekiel chapter 43? We'll just stick with verse 2, because, okay, if you could read that.
And behold, the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east, and his voice was like the noise of many waters, and the earth shined with his glory. Okay,
so the glory of God came from where he had departed, from the east. And verse 4 says, and the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate, whose prospect is toward the east. And verse 5, so the Spirit took me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. So the glory of God comes back into the house. And then in 44 and verse 4, similar, then brought he me the way of the north gate, and I looked, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord, and I fell upon my face. And the last verse of Ezekiel, the last verse says, and it was round about 18,000 measures, and the name of the city from that day shall be, the last word of Ezekiel is, the Lord is there. Again, what's there? The Lord and all of his glory. Right. So that's, to me, the outstanding theme of Ezekiel is the glory of God, and how in Ezekiel's day, because of their sin, the glory of God departed, but then God will restore glory to his house. And that's our hope during the kingdom. That's, again, why we pray. That's a huge prayer. Thy kingdom come. I always come back to that. Okay, any questions about that? Yes, Esther.
What is the answer for number 3, please? The vision of
Number 3 where?
page 14.
14. We didn't get there.
Oh.
We were doing the number 2, the vision of God's glory. See all those verses under that? That's what we just did. We looked up all those verses. So you have to know that. We spent that. That was okay. So now you want to know what number 3 is? The vision of?
Valley of the Dry Bones.
Exactly. So put that in there. Micah, say it again.
Oh, the Valley of the Dry Bones.
The vision of the valley of the dry bones. Yes.
Oh, so question before. So in the millennial temple, if that's what that is described at the end of Ezekiel, Jesus is separate from the glory, the Shekinah glory. They're both present, or
Yeah, I believe, yeah.
did the glory come into the second temple?
Yes. Oh, you mean in the rebuilding of the Ezra? That
Yeah.
not in a Not in a manifestation that I know of. Yeah. Now, we were just talking about this earlier, but in Ezekiel 37, there is this vision of the valley of dry bones. And in Ezekiel, if you go to Ezekiel 37, he says in verse 9, prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, son of man, say to the wind, thus saith the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me. The breath came unto them, and they lived and stood upon their feet, an exceeding great army. And he said unto me, son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried, our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. And then it was, bring you into the land of Israel, verse 12. Now, the question is Israel going into the land in 1948 a fulfillment of this prophecy? Some say that it is, and that's okay. I tend to believe that this is a prophecy of Israel being spiritually saved and then brought into that land. And I do think there's significance in Israel being back in their land after so many years not having an actual homeland. And now for us, in our day now, we're kind of used to it. But 1948 is when, they were officially given statehood once again, which was incredible that after all those years of them not having an actual state with their name upon it would have it, that they maintained their national identity. It has never happened like that on earth. So I think there is significance that God is not done with Israel for sure. So there is significance in them going back to the land, and it helps us to see how prophecy can be fulfilled. So, but this vision of dry bones, the millennial temple. Now, under here, three possibilities of what this temple is. And also, Geisler actually makes a point of this in your book, where he says it could be three things, and I think I have them here. It could be a temple built during Ezra's time after captivity. In other words, this could have been the temple that was rebuilt at that time after the captivity. Some say it figuratively speaks of the church. And some give a spiritual interpretation because in this temple, animal sacrifices are offered. And for those who say there can't be a return to animal sacrifices, that's probably their main argument for saying there can't be a literal millennium with the actual return to animal sacrifices. That just couldn't be. So that's probably their main argument. I think there are definitely arguments against that, because I do believe in a literal temple. I do believe there will be a return to animal sacrifices. We may have a hard time grasping now that would happen, but I do believe it will happen. So some people say that this is just like, it spiritually represents the church. And then others say it is a literal temple, still future. This is the temple of the millennial kingdom. I do believe that's the best answer of this the millennial temple. Now, could it be a temple of the eternal kingdom? Could Ezekiel be describing a temple that will be in the eternal kingdom? Not the millennium, but in the eternal kingdom. I don't think so. Why? Why? There's no temple. It says there's no temple there in the book of Revelation. So we're left with the millennium. Okay, let me try to get through this. Perhaps more than any prophet, Ezekiel taught in symbolic actions, signs. He used bricks. He laid on one side for 40 days or no, even more. 400. Imagine laying on your side for that. Man, my arm would have fallen asleep for sure. My shoulder would have hurt. And anyway, he baked bread with dung in it. He used barber's razor. He cut his hair. Vines and eagles and boiling pots. His wife died, and God told him, don't cry. I mean, what? Things like that. Parables, teaching tools, visions, as I said earlier, interactions with angelic beings. It's an amazing book. I hope that you'll take some time to read it. Now, there's an amazing letter D. Battle is amazing. battle of Gog and Magog. And again, we don't really have time, but it's talking about nations who will be fighting against Israel, Russia, Iran, Sudan. We could never imagine that happening, could we? You know, just think of this. Ezekiel wrote this BC, 600 or so BC. And he's talking about how Iran and Russia are going to be allied to fight against Israel. I mean, that's amazing, right?
Did they mention collusion?
Yeah. Sudan, Ethiopia, Libya, Turkey. These are all nations that are still very active on the world scene. Some say Germany could be, and so forth. Now, the interesting thing is when this battle will be fought. Different people say it will be fought in different plague times. I don't know if you ever heard of Joel Rosenberg, but he's written a book that I thought was very, very interesting called Epicenter. And he basically took Ezekiel and said, these are the headlines of our world today. So he thinks that this battle will happen before the rapture. Could be. I don't agree with it, but that's what he said. Some say that this battle will happen right before the middle of the tribulation, right before the Antichrist breaks his treaty. Now, some pre-trib, pre-mill, actually, that I respect, have that position. In other words, they say that this battle will happen right before the middle of the tribulation. Could be. I don't know. I believe this battle actually happens at the end of the millennium, because it's clearly referenced in the book of Revelation at the end of the millennium. And it is a time when Israel is dwelling in safety. In other words, the safety of the millennium. So that's my position on when this battle will be fought. So I put this in your notes. It seems best to place this battle at the end of the millennial kingdom when Israel dwells in safety. Ezekiel 38 and verse 8 and 11. And that little phrase too, if you look at that little phrase, if you want to do a study of dwelling safely in Jeremiah and other places, whenever that phrase is used, it always seems to refer to millennial peace. See, the millennium will be a time of peace for Israel, right? So when has Israel dwelt safely? I believe it will be during the millennium. And then the battle will be at the end of the millennium. So God will judge Gog and Magog, and Israel will turn back to the Lord. The Gentile nations will see the glory of the Lord. Okay. So the book of Ezekiel is a book of God's glory. The blanks on page 15, and then we'll be done. His judgments to come, his judgments upon Judah, his glory departs, judgment of the Gentile nations, his blessings then on national Israel. Letter A, the nation regathered, culminated with the sprinkling of clean water, the vision of dry bones, then the battle of Gog and Magog. Then the new temple with God's glory returning, and the new land, God's glory remaining. So, okay, you got all the blanks down? You got them? Yes. Okay, we went